Okay, so we'll review a little bit like we did last night, just to make sure, because we've been off for a week, that we still kind of know what the subject is. Oh, also on prayer request, Bridget, Denise Lake, we need to pray for her. I haven't heard back from her. She did break her hip, and she's not emailed me back to say how she's doing, so I'm a little concerned. I should have put that in there early too. All right, so let's get into our lesson here. And this is the passage that we're working with. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built with rows of stones, on which are hung 1,000 shields, all the round shields of the mighty men. Right. And so we've worked through that quite a bit. We're still talking about the temple. And the reminder is that we are the temple now. We are little sanctuaries. And he's also a sanctuary for us. You know, the same way that we dwell in him, he dwells in us. And Paul reminds the Corinthians 3 times. So when you have to say something 3 times, I think that's an indication we're prone to forget it. And I know I am. I'm prone to forget that the Spirit of Adonai dwells in me, that I'm this little movable temple, and I represent his presence on earth. And it is easy to forget that that's who you are. You know, when you're distracted with work, when you're distracted with so many little things, you can, you know, forget your focus. And so I think it's important to remind ourselves daily that we are the temple of the Holy Spirit. And, you know, if you do the daily prayers, if you do even, you know, if you do the Amidah once, the Shemona Esrei, if you do that once a day, it will remind you every day, because you pray every day for the restoration of the temple. And when you pray for the restoration of the temple, it always reminds me that, oh yeah, and until that day, I'm it. It's our responsibility to represent that holiness, that sanctuary, no matter where he scattered us. And that, I believe, was part of the purpose of scattering us, and so that the temple would be more accessible to the nations. And then in the end, they'll be without excuse. But it's our responsibility to make sure that we're representing him and his temple properly. Right. Okay. The 1,000 pieces of silver that were given for Sarah to clear her name as representing, again, those 1,000 generations, the 1,000 shields of the mighty men on the Tower of David representing our spiritual stature, the spiritual stature of Israel, and then the shields of 1,000 generations. That number 1,000 is representative of the perfection of what is promised to Abraham and Sarah. And so looking at, you know, that number of 1,000, that is going to be something you could put into your journal, or if you're keeping a list of symbolism, prophetic symbolism, one of the symbols that you can look at is the number 1,000, just like you learned the symbolism of numbers 1 through 7 when you did workbook 1. 1,000 is going to be tied very closely to the fulfillment of the covenant to the descendants of Abraham and Sarah, and that representative number is going to be 1,000. And therefore we get the 1,000 round shields, like the covenant promise at that point has been completed. And that's what we're seeing in the Song of Songs. We're seeing this song of resurrection when the 1,000 round shields will be completed. The last shield, the last generation will be placed on the tower. Okay. We looked at Sarah's tent, the 3 miracles associated with Sarah's tent, because if this was what brought comfort to Isaac when he puts Rebekah in his mother's tent, then again, it's telling you it's going down to the next generation. It's going down to the next shield on the tower. And so remember, it was one of the miracles that was thought to occur is her Shabbat light burned from one Shabbat to the next. In other words, it was an eternal light, like a ner tamid, a light that never went out. Again, symbolic of the menorah that would be later in the Mishkan, that would later, well, there were several menorot in the Mikdash, in the temple. There was always a blessing in her dough. It had a miraculous increase, just like the manna, just like Yeshua multiplying a little bit of bread into baskets left over. So a blessing in the dough. And then it was said a cloud was always hanging over a tent as divine protection, that the divine presence rested on her. We can see the Israelites walking in that divine cloud in the wilderness. We can see it inhabiting the Mishkan, the Mikdash later in the time of Solomon until this, its destruction. And we can also see Yeshua in the cloud. That's very clear in the Gospels. So we can see, again, once you kind of learn a context for something, it's easier to spot it somewhere else. But again, the promise to 1,000 generations, the descendants of Sarah, these should be characteristic of us too. We should have that light of the Ruach HaKodesh burning without interruption from one Shabbat to the next. But how you mark it is the Shabbat. That's what we got into last night. We got into, why is the Shabbat so important to us? Why is it, this special sign of those 1,000 generations? How can we know that we're part of the shield of that generation? It's going to be the Shabbat. We're going to go back to Isaiah 58. It has to be the Shabbat. That's our center. That's our working from point. And so the light burns from one Shabbat to the next. That's why it's so important, not just to observe Shabbat by ceasing from your labor, but in gathering together. And that was the whole point, because remember, eventually this eternal light rests in the Mishkan and the Mikdash. And the whole point of these is it drew Israel together. It gathered them together. Shabbat is a gathering day. If we didn't feel like it was explicitly stated in the Torah, then we can't make any mistake with Yeshua, because it says his custom, what he did over and over and over, is he would go to the synagogue for Shabbat. He would gather. We know he went up to the temple for the feast, even though the temple was not under an ideal administration at that time. He nevertheless did not neglect to go to the appointed place, because there's a sanctity in the place, regardless of what's sitting on top of it. I think maybe that's something I left out last night or didn't address last night as we went through the Midrash, commenting on the sanctity of the sanctuary, the temple, the house. The sanctity is there, regardless of what's on top of it, regardless of whether the temple stands or doesn't stand, regardless of whether there are idolatrous things on top of it or not on top of it. That place is still a place of sanctity, and we have to continue to reverence it as a place of sanctity, because that's where that was the place. It says where he says, I will put my name. We can get bogged down in things like the pronunciation of the name and so forth, but he's saying that's where my name is. If you want to understand me, then you need to go to this place. You need to gather with one another in this place. So a pilgrimage wasn't something that you did any day of the year you picked, although you could go any day of the year. That's not the appointed time. The day that you pick is not the appointed time. The day that he picks is the appointed time. And that's how you regenerate in terms of the light, the Sabbath there, that's the focal point. And that's why the menorah was so important to the Mishkan and the Mikdash. You want Israel to be that light to the nations that's ever burning. How will you make sure this light is regenerated? Part of that process is being willing to gather at his appointed time with his people. His appointed time with his people, not at your appointed time with your people. That's a hard one for people to leap over nowadays, but it's just as truthful today as it was when these words were written in terms of the Shabbat. We need to have a blessing in the dough. Right? Does that mean we're miraculously multiplying bread? Doesn't mean we're doing it. It means that we're willing to be the vessel to do that. And so through our agency, we can serve in two ways. We can feed the poor, literally. And I think this group of people is definitely one that's characterized by constantly opening their hands to the poor, to the needy, to the orphan, to the widow. I think we way outgive our numbers. I think Torah keepers way outgive their numbers when you compare them to other people. I mean, it's like it's being internalized. He was like serious about that. You know, it's a shame sometimes we think, well, Yeshua was just going to have to tell him. He was serious about that, but I think we get it. He was serious about meeting the physical needs of the poor. But at the very same time, there are people who are poor who might be 300 pounds overweight. They don't know they're poor, but they're poor in the word. They're destitute of the word. And because remember last night, one of the points we made is if you want to comprehend this light we're talking about, you have to pursue it. There's no passive receiving of the word. It's something that has to be in the English word that was used was comprehended. It didn't enlighten us one bit. Like, oh, we didn't understand it. Understanding is just not a tangible. It's something that occurs in your head that nobody can see unless maybe your eyeballs pop out a little bit. It's not observable. But when we looked it up in Greek, it's like it's something to be pursued. It's something to be obtained. It's something to be found, to be laid hold of. There's an exertion, there's an effort to bring it forth. And so the blessing in the dough is going to be a matter of effort expended in the word. Because, you know, the bread of heaven, it is the word. We have to expend effort in order to increase the word in the earth. We can be part of that. And also the cloud hanging over the tent. Again, that's the presence of Adonai. When did the presence of Adonai depart? When we rebelled, when we complained, when we sinned. Those sorts of things will make the cloud lift. But when we're walking in obedience, when we're walking in compliance, when we're walking in gratefulness and humility, that's when they were very safe in the protection of the divine cloud. And we want people to sense that about us, even if they can't physically see a cloud hanging over us. Typically, when we think somebody's got a cloud hanging over them, we're thinking like a bad cloud. But the divine cloud, remember, was very bright. It was so bright, they had a hard time looking at it. When the disciples saw Yeshua on the Mount of Transfiguration with Moses and Elijah, it's like, oh my goodness, I can't look at this. It's not a dark cloud. It's a bright cloud. And therefore, again, it's conspicuous, like the Tower of David. Our observance is conspicuous to other people. And we don't do the commandments to be seen and noticed by others for any personal virtue. What we want to do is to be a reflection of the spirit of Adonai that is in us. And it's a fine line sometimes. It's a very fine line, but not so good things happen to people who misunderstand where that line is and begin to do spiritual things in order to draw attention to themselves rather than attention to the Holy One. That'll make the cloud depart too. And we don't want that to happen. Right? So these 1,000 generations, this should be what characterizes us. You know, if you could sum it up, we should be full of the Spirit, and we should be known as people of generosity, people of hospitality. Okay. Right. So last night too, we talked about the Yirat Adonai. Remember, it's the 7th spirit that you learned in workbook 1. And it's associated with Shabbat because it's the 7th. And then we know that the fear of the Lord, or the reverence of the Lord, the Yirat Adonai, we're told that it leads to what? Wisdom. It takes you back to the beginning. So it ties it together. It's a never-ending cycle. You go from 7 to 1 to through the cycle again and again and again. You don't really do that without growing in your respect. Sometimes it's translated as fear, awe, or reverence. It depends on your translation. All of those are true. If we're trying to put an English word on it, all of those are true. It can also mean terror. Remember, the context determines how you're going to relate to the Holy One. If you've been disobedient, rebellious, complaining, these sorts of things, then you have a reason to be terrorized by his presence. But if you're walking with him faithfully, if you're walking as a son or a daughter, then what you will walk in is a very intense sense of reverence and awe for him. And that awe, that 7th spirit that sums up all of them, because remember, you don't invent anything new on Shabbat. It's simply the sum of days 1 through 6, and you rest in that work that you've done on days 1 through 6. So the fear of Adonai is something that's not brand new on Shabbat. It's the culmination of how you have walked in wisdom, how you've walked in understanding, how you've walked in counsel, how you've walked in power, how you've walked in the knowledge, the intimacy with him. And all that we can say is characterized by reverencing him. And that's why the reverence leads to wisdom. It's showing that they're linked here. We don't want to artificially, we study them in isolation so that we can understand them, but we never want to separate out those 7 spirits of Adonai, because it's one Holy Spirit. Right? The individual expressions of it can help us understand how the Spirit moves, but it's not 7 different things. It's one Spirit, right? And different aspects of it we might draw upon in certain circumstances. So last night we went back to Leviticus 26:2, as the Midrash points out. It says the awe of God issued from the holy temple. And this why it states, my Sabbaths you shall observe, and my sanctuary you shall fear, reverence, have awe of, tira'u. And they said the verse indicates that the sanctuary is sanctified in its destruction, just as it was sanctified when it still stood. So not only was the sanctuary process transferred to his people at the destruction of the temple, and we should reverence what we are in him. Sometimes we don't reverence who we are. We underestimate who we are in him. And when we think about it, and I know it's our tendency sometimes as human beings to underestimate ourselves, low self-esteem, and all these things that we are as human beings. But when we truly understand who we are in him, that in the same way that we would approach the temple in Jerusalem, there is a little bit of that same spirit of reverence that we should have for our relationship with him. And this is why Paul keeps reiterating, don't you know that you're the temple? Don't you know that somebody that tries to destroy you is going to be destroyed? That's the promise. Anybody who ever destroyed the temple, they were destroyed. It's just a matter of time. And so when people attack you for your faith, for your holiness, for your obedience, as long as it wasn't something that was self-serving rather than serving the Father, their day will come. You can be assured that their day will come. And, if they were smart, like Avimelech, they would come to us and say, pray for me. Pray that this plague will stop. They don't necessarily have the sense to do that. But we can still intercede for them, even before they have the sense to come ask us to forgive them. Number one, if they sinned against us. And number two, that there's going to be some things that happen in their lives that are a direct result of the attacks they've made upon the saints. And it might happen even in this life. It's not necessarily reserved until the next. There will be things that can happen to them in this life that are a result of the way that they've treated the saints. The ultimate destruction, of course, still awaits. The souls under the altar are telling us that. How long, O Lord? Until our blood is avenged. There will be an ultimate vengeance before that happens, before any calamity befalls them, even in this life. If we can, it's very important to intercede for them. Like Yeshua said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And so this is part of your being the temple. You are here to help sanctify the earth. And even though we're not on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, you are a little bit of that Temple Mount wherever you are right now. Wherever you are sitting right now, or standing, or walking, or driving. Right now, you are a little bit of that temple sanctuary in the place where you are. And you are there to stand against destruction. If you're on the interstate right now, pray that there be no wrecks. Pray that people will not be angry and rage. If you're at home, pray over your children. Pray over the people who come through your house. If you're at work, pray over your work. You are there to sanctify that place as much as possible. You are there to intercede for them because they're doing Avimelech things out there. They're sinning out there. The solution to stop the plagues on earth is for us to pray, just like the solution was for Abraham to intercede for Avimelech to stop the plague in his house. Just like the solution was for Aaron to take the censer, the incense, which represents the prayer, and to run and stand between the plague and the people. Did they deserve it? No, they absolutely did not deserve it. But he interceded anyway, because he was the representative of the holy sanctuary. You are the representative of the holy sanctuary. You are the emissary. And like I say, if we can just keep that at the front of our consciousness at all times, it will change the way you look at trials and tribulations. Instead of continually seeing ourselves as victims of those trials and tribulations, all of a sudden we will have a sense that I'm in this situation because I'm supposed to pray for these heathens. I'm supposed to pray for these destroyers before it's too late. And so this is what the Midrash is trying to teach us. The sanctuary is sanctified in its destruction, just as it was sanctified when it still stood. Just as you don't stop observing the Shabbat, neither does the sanctity of the sanctuary stop. Just because the building is not there doesn't mean that we stop observing the Sabbath, because it predated the building. Just because we don't have a temple built doesn't mean that we stop reverencing Adonai And it doesn't mean we stop reverencing his sanctuary. Again, this is why we pray toward Jerusalem. Actually, Solomon started that. When he prayed, even for the nations, he says, when they turn toward this, your holy temple. Well, for most of history, when the nations turned toward his holy temple, it wouldn't be there. At least the physical representation. Does the spiritual representation of the temple above, is it still up there? You bet it's still up there, just waiting for the area below to be cleansed. Once that occurs, once Yeshua prepares that place, cleanses that place, then it can once again descend and marry. But until that time, we don't have permission to trash the place where it stood any more than we have permission to trash one another. So we want to be just really careful what we say about other believers, because of course they're imperfect. We're all imperfect. It doesn't give us permission to trash one another. Okay. And then we went into, where are we getting the 1,000 generations? It goes back to the covenant, Abraham and Sarah. And then that covenant, we can see it realized at Mount Sinai, when now those generations that had not yet been conceived, where Isaac was still, inside Abraham and Sarah, where Jacob was inside Isaac, who was still inside Abraham and Sarah. But now at Mount Sinai, we've got millions of people from those 12 tribes. And they make that commitment to the covenant, and we can see the equality, equivalence of expression between covenant and word. And that word, it says twice, he commanded it to 1,000 generations. And so I don't know when the covenant was supposed to have stopped. I don't know how people think Yeshua somehow abrogated the covenant when 1,000 generations hadn't been fulfilled. There are still souls being brought in to the covenant. And it stands there still to this day, awaiting for the completion of those 1,000 shields, because when that 1,000th shield goes into place, there will be a resurrection of the dead. And so the 1,000 generations are going to be those descendants of Abraham and Sarah. And then, of course, John 1:1, it expands upon the word. If the covenant is equivalent to the word, try reading it that way. I mean, we don't want to change the wording. We're not saying we're going to change the wording of the Bible. That's not what we're doing. But try it to figure out the equivalency of expression. In the beginning was the covenant. And the covenant was with God. And the covenant was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. And him was life, and the life was the light of men. Right? The Torah is light. The commandment is a lamp. And now, if you were doing one of those cluster things that they can do to show like how many times a word appears, if you could do those clusters there and see how many times these words appear next to one another in context, the word, the covenant, the beginning, life, light, Torah, commandments, these things are all in the same cluster, and they are for 1,000 generations. The problem is it's usually a remnant in each generation, because it says this light, this word, this life, this covenant, it shines in the darkness, but the darkness doesn't, in English, comprehend it. What does that mean? What does it mean they don't comprehend it? It means they don't lay hold of it so as to make it their own. The light is there. Darkness is a place. It's an identity. If you don't actively seek the word, By default, you're darkness. And if you don't seek, you cannot obtain. You have to lay hold of it so as to make it your own. It's a prize. So you have to seek it out actively. This is the inheritance of Sarah's tent. This is the inheritance of 1,000 generations. And like I say, it's always been a remnant. But the remnant has always been there to shine that light and that life that has been present from the beginning. In the person of Messiah Yeshua, we could see it so much more clearly that even the nations began to take hold of it. And of course, the adversary is going to throw some obstructions out there. That's his job. He's an adversary. Right, so let's just review this right here. First Chronicles 16:16, the covenant which he made with Abraham and his oath to Isaac. He also confirmed it to Jacob for a statute, to Israel as an everlasting covenant, saying, to you, I will give the land of Canaan as the portion of your inheritance. Right, so through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then to Israel, their descendants. It's an everlasting covenant. It's that word to 1,000 generations. That remnant from the 1,000 generations will inherit. They will receive the land of Canaan. And like we've said a million times, almost, the land of Canaan, Israel, the promised land, it's not just a physical land. The Garden of Eden is hovering just above it. It's a place that you can only inhabit if you are not separated from Yeshua, from the Word. Remember, Yeshua is the Word. You can't be separated from the Word and inherit that place. And so it's a place not only where the saints are awaiting resurrection and they're being protected there while they await the resurrection of their bodies, this is the place to which the inheritors can attain. It doesn't mean that there won't still be a whole wide world out there with people in it. There will be. There will be people in Yeshua's kingdom, but not all will inherit with him. It's those who have clung to the everlasting covenant. That's what sets them apart. That's what makes them part of those 1,000 generations. If you did not actively obtain the word, if you did not actively seek after the word to obey it as a covenant, then it would be hard to categorize you as one of these 1,000 generations of shields, because those who actively sought to lay hold of the covenant became the shields of their generations. They're counted for the inheritance. And, like I say, our bodies will have special abilities like Yeshua. We will be able to dwell in this garden. We will be able to dwell in the holy city, but not everybody will. There are realms to be moved into and out of, but without resurrection from the dead, you won't be able to go or even see all the places that the saints are equipped to go. Because they do. They not only have the shield of Abraham, they have the resurrection. They were shields in their generation. They were conspicuous. And so this, again, it's out of the Midrash commenting on these shields. And it goes back, you have to think back 2 or 3 weeks now, to where we talked about the crossing of the Reed Sea. When Jacob crossed the Jordan, he said, with this staff, I crossed the Jordan, or I crossed this Jordan. And so they say the waters parted when he brought those sons across. This was repeated, of course, when the 12 tribes crossed over to displace the Canaanite kings. And in the middle there was the crossing of the Reed Sea to bring them out of Egypt to bring them out of the realm of sin and death. He says, all the thousands and myriads that crossed the Yarden River, and whom I shielded, they were guarded from the Canaanite kings. Remember, it says when they stood at Mount Sinai and said, we will do and we will hear, it says he removed the belts of the kings. He removed any authority they had to be there that might have shielded them. And those belts of authority were placed upon the Israelites. And now they only had the authority to be there. And that's coming again. You know, that was a prophetic time. Looking forward, there will only be certain people allowed for certain reasons in the land of Israel. Those who might have been in that land and admit it, they're there because the Holy One allows them to be there. In a sense, he's put a belt around them. You say, well, how could they possibly have any authority in that land? If he's allowing it, he's allowing it. But a day will come where he will remove their belts. He will remove any authority they have to be in that place. And then it will be again up to Israel to know that those belts have been placed around them. And now they are empowered to go in and to settle in that land. And no unauthorized person can from that time forward be in that place. Right? So all the thousands and myriads that crossed the Yarden River and whom I shielded only in the merit of the one who came for 1,000 generations, Yeshua. And that comes from Pirkei Avot 1:1, which is, it means the sayings of the fathers. And the beauty of this prophecy is that Yehoshua, who succeeded Moses, the contraction of his name is Yeshua. Yeshua, salvation. It was pretty frequent that they would contract a name like we do in English sometimes. Another example would be Elishua became Elisha. So that happens sometimes. But knowing that the fullness of Yeshua's name would be Yehoshua, right here is a prophecy. Yeshua came for 1,000 generations. He is the word that is going to preserve 1,000 generations. He is the covenant that's going to preserve 1,000 generations. He is the light and the life of 1,000 generations. And so this early picture of Yehoshua succeeding Moshe and then leading the people across the Yarden, symbolically leading them back into the garden, that is exactly prophesying the work of Yeshua, who is going to come for that when that last shield is placed on the Tower of David. Yeshua will lead us over into our inheritance. And they say, it is not you alone who depended upon the merit of Yeshua, but all shiltei. Shiltei is going back into the Hebrew of the verse. The mighty men, it means the mighty men. All shiltei. For anyone, and this is how you become a shield in your generation. Yes, there are particular people who rise up in their generation, like Moses, like Yehoshua, maybe like Gideon. There's been a remarkable shield, a messianic-like figure in every generation. But there were also individuals who were mighty men. They were part of the shield of that generation. It says, anyone who rises and rules and prevails over his evil inclination, such as Moses in his time, David in his time, and Ezra in his time, their whole generation depends on their merit. Put yourself in that same place. We are part of this generation. And when we rise up, when we rule over and we prevail over our evil inclination, we're like Moses, we're like David, we're like Ezra, because remember, all these people sinned. They weren't perfect. They were just like us. Like what he said, Elijah was a man just like we are. But look what he did. Look at the miracles he did. Okay, we're just normal human beings. But when we rise and rule over our evil inclination, our whole generation depends upon us to do that. Our whole generation, this is what young people need to know. So many of them are hopeless. They have no purpose. Maybe they grew up in a home where everything was conspiracies and the world's going to end tomorrow. And, you know, back in the 40s and 50s, it was the shadow of nuclear war. We're just going to blow the earth up. There's a hopelessness that's been passed down. It's not a, you know, it's not a surprise this generation is so hopeless. The seeds were sown long ago of this hopelessness. What's the point of even being here? The suicide rates are off the charts. The crazy rates are off the charts. Why? Addiction rates are off the charts. Why? Because I don't think we have a full sense of how much our generation depends upon us, because it's not a tangible. We can't. It's not like if we keep a commandment somewhere, we hear this ka-ching. It's not like that. In fact, sometimes we might keep a commandment and feel bad because it's not what people expected of us, because we feel like, oh, that might have offended somebody, you know, that I kept that commandment. You know, somebody might feel like I don't love them because I don't do it their way. There's all sorts of things that are going to come up. And it's not generally going to be a cha-ching of triumph. I kept a commandment or I didn't disobey one. But see, if there was a better sense of that, I think especially with our young people, they would understand, no, there's not going to be a cha-ching out there in the universe. But every time I walk in covenant, every time I obey the word, I'm saving my generation. My generation is depending upon me. And we need to never lose that sense that we are part of that Tower of David that is arising in this last day. And I think we're very close to the last shield in this day. We could be the last generation. We don't know. And that's important that we don't know, because I think we wouldn't try nearly as hard if we didn't know. If we knew, you know, we might give ourselves permission to slack off. And look, every generation, you have to come in saying, this could be the last one. This generation, the last generation, is depending upon me. That last shield going into place depends upon me, because I'm just a human being like Moses, David, and Ezra. But every time I rise up and rule over evil in my life, I'm a mighty person. Just like Yehoshua rose up in his generation. He was just Moses' little helper for all those years in the wilderness, followed him around for 40 years, just Moses' little helper. Don't you think they made fun of him? Well, that's, you see Moses, you're going to see Yehoshua. That's okay. He hung around with a righteous man for 40 years, and he led them over into their inheritance. It's okay if people make fun of you, if they mock you, if they belittle you. It's okay. You just keep rising up and prevailing over that evil inclination. You join yourself to righteous people. They're not perfect people, but they're walking in the same direction. And you are creating a great shield, because just imagine if we weren't here right now, judging from the state of confusion the world is in right now, imagine how much worse it would be. That's hard to imagine, but we have to. And here's how Yeshua taught us to pray, referring again back here. If you rise and rule over your evil inclination, what is that? Yeshua taught it in the Lord's Prayer. He says, pray like this: Our Father who is in heaven, holy is your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. And the reason I put the Greek in there is so you would see the ellipsis in the translation. It's actually the evil. I think maybe in the Complete Jewish Bible, I think they actually did translate it like that, the evil. But you can go back there and you can look up the Greek there, because there is something known as the evil inclination. There is a part of us, ever since the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, there is a part of us that is acquainted with evil. And because we're acquainted with it, it exerts a force in our lives. And when we go into those places of temptation, it tends to become stronger. That evil becomes, that pull, that desire, it tends to strengthen when we are places of temptation. So we pray, please don't lead us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil inclination. And the importance, if you look at the context, see how much of this is acknowledging the one who is in heaven, that his name is holy, it's his kingdom, it's his will, even on earth. And therefore, who can deliver us from the evil inclination? He can. But we have to be a partner with him. And the way to partner with him, it goes on, it says, for yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. How do we prevail over the evil inclination? We just keep acknowledging it's not our world. I'm not awesome. He is awesome. I have no holiness apart from him. I'm not in heaven, I'm on earth. It's his kingdom that will come, not my kingdom that will come. It's his will that will be done, not my will that will be done. Only when I conform my will to his will can I say my will be done. This is part of overcoming so that we can be strengthened, that our shields will strengthen for the evil days. So the sages are saying, Yehoshua, he was a shield to 1,000 generations. He was one that rose up in his generation. Think of people like Pinchas. Think of Deborah. Think of all these mighty people. They're just the same as us. They just rose to the occasion. And so Yeshua is teaching us that anyone who rules over the evil in his generation, you become a shield to that generation. And the world is depending upon those shields. And part of our job is we're defending the Tower of David. And remember, one of the identifications of the Tower of David was the Temple Mount. The temple itself was considered the Tower of David. The strength of David, the Migdal, it means strength. Tower does. So when we defend the word, we are defending the temple that we are, because his word resides in us. We are defending our generation as shields. And remember, it says, don't forget the sanctity of the temple. Don't forget the sanctity of the Temple Mount. Don't forget the sanctity of Jerusalem. It doesn't matter if it's not 100% under the control of the Israeli government right now. That's irrelevant. it still has sanctity. By the way we conduct our lives wherever we are helping to defend the sanctity of that temple, that place, until its restoration. And so in the Lord's Prayer, part of reminding ourselves to be the shields, to be the mighty ones of our generation, we have to continually acknowledge that Adonai is sovereign. We have to continually acknowledge that he is the supplier of help. Not only does he supply our spiritual bread, our spiritual needs, but he supplies our earthly needs as well. And if we will accept that, then it's going to give us the strength to withstand that evil inclination. See, it's when we start saying, I am awesome, that we start disbelieving that he will help us. He is our helper. We have to keep saying, he's awesome. He is holy. It's his kingdom. It's his will. When I shift that over to me, that's when I'm weakened. That's when it becomes very difficult to withstand the Satan. Satan with a small s, it means adversary, Satan. And what does the Satan do? What does the adversary do? Well, he's going to accuse us when we don't withstand this evil inclination inside of us. And so we become our own adversary. We begin to accuse ourselves. Our actions now start to accuse us. So, yeah, we're a little bit bipolar, but we don't have to be. And, it goes back to being mature in the word. The more we mature in the word, the more control we're going to have over this evil inclination, which will rise up to accuse us, which will become an adversary. So let's review this right here. Remember, it says, my Sabbaths you shall observe, my sanctuary you shall fear, in English, tira'u, you shall reverence. And remember, it says the sanctuary is sanctified in its destruction, just as it was sanctified when it still stood. The sanctity is still in the place, and the sanctity is still in you. And he's pairing that sanctity with your observance of Shabbat. To be a temple of the Ruach HaKodesh is to observe the Shabbat. Zehu, that's all. That sums it up. How will people know we are the temple? We observe Shabbat. We gather on Shabbat. So, yes, we cease our secular work. We cease doing our own thing on Shabbat because we are those shields hung on the Tower of David. We're protecting the world when we reverence his sanctuary. We're protecting the world when we reverence even who we are on his holy Shabbat. If we don't know who we are, then we're not going to show up. And here's what it says in Isaiah 58, 13 through 14. It says, if, because of the Sabbath, you turn your foot from doing your own pleasure on my holy day. See how he says, turn your foot? Remember especially, you've got weekly Sabbaths, but you also have the annual high Sabbaths, the 3 foot festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot. So he's making even a little reference here, not just to your weekly Sabbath, but to your high Sabbaths, your foot festivals. If because of the Shabbat, you turn your foot from doing your own pleasure on my holy day and call the Shabbat a delight, oneg, the holy day of the Lord, honorable, and honor it, desisting from your own ways, from seeking your own pleasure and speaking your own word, then you will take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth. What are the heights of the earth? Jerusalem, Israel, your inheritance. Remember, they're a level above. Most of us have only ever seen Israel in its natural state. We have not seen the heights of it. But he says, if you'll do this, if you'll keep the Shabbat, you're going to experience the heights of the earth. You're going to experience what Israel actually is. He says, I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob, your father. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. He's reminding us that we're part of these 1,000 generations. He will feed us. There's supernatural food. It's the bread of heaven. There's Yeshua, the word, the life, the light, resurrection, entering into the garden, entering into a realm of Israel that most eyes have not seen and ears have not heard. But he says, this is how it must be done. You have to engage the Shabbat. Everything is going to hinge on this. How are you going to be able to do the things that Yeshua said to pray for? Like, give us this day our daily bread. You realize that the hardest day to trust is Shabbat. That's why the Israelites went out trying to pick up manna on Shabbat. They didn't trust him to provide their daily bread. And so there's an elevated place of faith. And he's saying, if you want to begin to elevate your faith, then really focus on Shabbat. Not just ticking off boxes, because if you read the entire chapter of Isaiah 58, you can see Shabbat is the culmination of what should have been done the rest of the week. And so he compares their fast days. Like, why are you fasting? You're fasting and you're wanting to see something from me, but you're not taking care of the poor. You're not taking care of the needy. It's these things you should be doing all week so that everybody can rest and have pleasure in my holy day. For a poor person, it's not that pleasurable because they couldn't put the things by on those first 6 days that somebody who has plenty could. And it goes back to the ministering of the word. If we're not ministering the word 6 days of the week, how can we enjoy the Shabbat? If it's not an intimacy of our lives 6 days of the week, then how can we expect him to supply our daily bread? We didn't pursue it. We didn't comprehend it. We didn't actively try to obtain it on those 6 days of the week. And so Shabbat's really no different. We're trying to rest in something that we haven't prepared for. That's why each Shabbat has a preparation day. And you need to take stock. What do I still need to do to prepare? And if we will prepare by taking care of others, he will always take care of us. Because remember, everything hinges upon loving Adonai and loving his people, loving your neighbor. And that's part of the context of Isaiah 58. But we want to feed on the heritage of Jacob. We want to be part of those 1,000 generations. This is part of the key. And I think that's really if we put that with the prayer that Yeshua taught, what was he holding up? Acknowledging Adonai as the king. And if the king says, this is my holy day, it's just up to us to honor it. It's not us to pick our appointed times. But we do sometimes. Because the Sabbath becomes an inconvenience for our appointed times. We turn our foot away. Because his pleasure doesn't seem as important as our pleasure. We turn away. Because keeping Shabbat doesn't seem nearly as delightful as this thing I want to do over here. We say, I am awesome. We don't say he is awesome. We say, I am awesome. We don't say your kingdom come. We say my kingdom come. My will be done on earth as it is in heaven. If we could see how his will was done in heaven, we would have no desire to do our will on earth. if it deviated in the least from what his will was. If it deviated in the least, we wouldn't want it. But that's what faith is all about. It's being able to envision what has not yet been manifest in this physical world. So we have to delight in Shabbat to become a functional sanctuary. We have to change our hearts from, oh, how awesome I am, to, oh, how awesome he is. This is how we overcome the evil. This is how we train ourselves to quit seeking our own pleasure over his. Because what pleases him is when we minister to others. What pleases him is when we try to bring others into the house. He wants to be a sanctuary to everyone. He wants us to disciple more little sanctuaries so that he can dwell in them, so that they can be part of this gathering. And again, if you have time today or this week, go back and read the whole context of Isaiah 58 and how important it is to him that we bring the needy into his house, that we bring the needy into his temple. Because if we bring the needy into his house, now they in turn become little sanctuaries. They in turn become part of the shield of their generation. But as long as we're not sincerely praying the Lord's Prayer, if instead we're substituting our kingdom, our will, then we're not really growing in that respect. We're not really being part of the mighty people of our generation. We're not really desiring to be a part of the remnant of that generation that rise up to become shields. And remember, these things, they don't have to be spectacular. Your obedience does not have to be something that makes the newspaper. We don't even have newspapers anymore, do we? It doesn't have to make the internet. It doesn't have to make the evening news. It doesn't have to make Facebook or Instagram or whatever it is that people look at today. Your acts of obedience may never be noticed until we cross over. And all of a sudden, what you thought was so insignificant, just some little insignificant act of obedience, it's going to be a tower in his kingdom. It's going to be huge in his kingdom. And so we are not Elohim. We don't supply the food of the word. We pass on. He is the originator of the word. He's the originator of the covenant. He's the originator of life. He's the originator of light. He's the originator of Yeshua. We are the recipients of it. We cannot be him, but we can be a reflection of him, because that's exactly what shields did. They were polished, so they became like mirrors. And that's what we want to do. We want to polish up our shields so that when people see, if they do manage to observe us, keeping a commandment, being obedient, that it's going to be a reflection of him that we see. So I guess that's a good place to stop before we, next week, I want to get into, and I'll put it in the link to today's class, but I'd like for you to go back and review a lesson. I want to say it was 2019 and 20. I'll find it and put the link in there. It's called 24. It's on the Torah portion, Pinchas, because it's going to come back up in next week's lesson. This zeal as far as being part of the 1,000 generations and the revenge on the Midianites during the time of Pinchas, that zeal, because we revisit that in the book of Revelation. It's the war with Midian is actually revisited in the book of Revelation. And so I'm going to put that link in there. So if you have time this week, go back and re-listen to that. And that'll help us get ready for next week's lesson.